What's up, my friends? It's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. I got a friend named Austin who from time to time likes to point out that he was technically correct on a thing he just said. And then he always gets this little giggly, snarky smile, and he's like, which is the best kind of correct? And of course, he's being tongue-in-cheek, wink, wink, nod, nod. Nobody likes the pedantic, that was technically right guy. And so he's making fun of himself, and he's perfectly self-aware, I assure you. But we're not always totally self-aware, as we've discussed several times over the last few episodes. And from time to time, we do talk ourselves into believing that being technically correct is the best kind of correct, when really technically correct is probably actually the smarmiest, least useful kind of correct. And it causes us to roll our eyes when other people try to get us on those kind of technicalities. And the reason that technically correct is such an obnoxious thing is because we can all tell it violates the spirit of the point. It violates the intent of whatever thing we're debating or discussing in order to get away with something. It's slick. And that's exactly what we're running into here in Matthew chapter 19. Jesus gives a big long speech. People like it, even though it's very demanding. They follow him across state lines into Judea. The Pharisees show up and they want to wreck the whole beautiful thing. And so they hit him with some stupid, are you going to be technically correct or not question? And they ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? And then, as we discussed yesterday, Jesus baselines the expectation for gender roles and marriage and what everybody in the crowd would have been expecting at this point in history. And he replies, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. And as we discussed yesterday, there's always two things you can do with a passage like this that just happens to overlap with hot button issues of the day. Thing you can do, number one, is exclusively deal with hot button issues of the day. But this has not been a historical hot button issue passage. If we made a heat map with no color representing no controversy over this passage at all, green representing light, and orange and red representing heavy controversy, and then we put it into GIF form and just scrolled all of Matthew. Here's all of the different chapters all lined out, and we're going to scroll 2,000 years of history, and we'll see which ones pop as being hot and controversial. Pretty much Matthew 16 and Peter's confession of Christ, that one's going to be pretty hot from at least 1500 on, probably quite a ways before that as well. But other things are going to come and go. And at the very, 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 very end of the cycle of that little GIF, you're going to see one little poof of orange or red on this passage here. For most of history, this one's been pretty tame. And that brings us to the second option that we have when we get to a passage like this, which is instead of enslaving the passage to current controversies, you instead think about it in its original context. And here, I think it's beautiful. The idea here is that Jesus is saying that God made stuff, and he made stuff in a beautiful way, and part of the way God designed the universe is that people want to be with each other, and that love is an actual thing, and that love is represented and expressed in marriage. What Jesus is implicitly acknowledging here is that marriage is a pretty good idea for making stuff work. Pretty much every culture ever, Western or otherwise, has thought of this one, because it gets weird and sometimes violent and emotionally taxing and destructive to try to have a society where you live out all of your life with no deepest level commitment from another person, where instead it's always transient and, well, if it goes well, I guess we'll stay after this, but if it gets weird, I'm out. Marriage is a way to set up some boundary markers and be like, all right, now we have the promises and the stability to do the marriage and family thing, to build something together. And even if we do stupid crap or hurt each other, we still got these vows and we can stand in and we can figure this thing out and mend broken hearts. There's something very stabilizing about this for the individual, for the society, for the community of faith. But as we're going to see in just a little bit here, Jesus also acknowledges that this isn't going to be the case for everybody, and it doesn't need to be the case for everybody, but that doesn't do anything to diminish the high value that Jesus is placing on love, knowing and being known, and the idea of marriage here in this passage. And it's treated as something very sacred. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. So Jesus says yet another thing that is beautiful and redemptive, and the Pharisees say yet another thing that is pedantic, gunning for technically correct. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Here's what's so funny about this to me. Jesus got into a Bible battle with Lucifer, Prince of Darkness, and won. And now these guys are coming to him after all of his teaching and all of the stuff that he's done. And they're like, okay, well, why is it like this? And he answers, and they're like, oh, but did you forget about this part of the Bible? And my guess would be that Jesus had not forgotten about that part of the Bible. And was like, oh, yeah. Really? No, that passage totally escaped my mind. Oh, well, now that you mentioned that passage, sure, great, excellent. Yeah, my bad. I apologize for getting all of that wrong. No, Jesus knows what he's talking about. He knows that verse is in the Bible. And now he's going to do the thing he does where he flips it around and points out the hypocrisy of the person who's accusing him. Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. In other words, Jesus is saying the problem isn't with me. The problem isn't with the Bible. The problem is with you and the tradition you represent. This is a concession for a destructive, evil reality that you people had allowed to creep into your family of faith that God built through his servant Abraham. And no, ideally, there would be no divorce. I mean, man, you flip over to Malachi 2, right at the very, very end of the Old Testament, and stuff is turned into a religious sham, and lots of people are doing the technically correct thing. And the prophet Malachi calls it out. And listen to this language. Malachi 2, it's at the beginning, 3. Because of you, this is God talking to his chosen people, I will rebuke your descendants. I will spread on your faces the offal from your festival sacrifices, and you will be carried off with it. Oh my goodness. That is withering. One of the things that he then goes on to list on a long list of stuff that his people are getting wrong is divorce. And starting in verse 13, he talks about this lousy attitude that the people were having toward their wives and this exploitative mentality they held toward their wives. Starting in verse 13, it says, another thing you do, you flood the Lord's altar with tears. You weep and wail because he no longer pays attention to your offerings or accepts them with pleasure from your hands. You ask, why? Is it because the Lord is acting as the witness between you and the wife of your youth? Because you've broken faith with her, though she's your partner, the wife of your marriage covenant? Has not the Lord made them one in flesh and in spirit? They're his. And why one? Because he was seeking godly offspring. So guard yourself in your spirit and don't break faith with the wife of your youth. I hate divorce, says the Lord God of Israel. And I hate a man's covering himself with violence as well as with his garment, says the Lord Almighty. So guard yourself in your spirit and do not break faith. Wow! Such potent language from God saying exactly what he thinks about divorce. He doesn't like it. He really doesn't like it. And at this point, again, I know there are some of you who are divorced, tons of you who are divorced, and your heart hurts over that. And whatever it was, you can't do anything about it now. It's a mess. It's a brutal thing that you went through in the past. And I cannot stress this enough. For you, for me, for any of us, the past is the past. You can't undo it. You can't change it. The best you can do is be right with God, be right with the people maybe you got it wrong with now, and move forward in grace and forgiveness. So my friends, you are not getting judgment from me on the difficult things you've gone through, on the deepest hurts of your heart that you bring with you because of broken relationships, because of divorce. The forgiveness and grace of God has been on every page of everything we've looked at in Matthew, but he never dishes out that forgiveness and grace by pretending that he doesn't have any standards. He's always very upfront with those standards. Those standards demonstrate that we don't meet those standards. And then he sends his son to die on a cross so that there'll be forgiveness and so that the righteousness of God can be imparted to us, though we are broken because of violence, because of divorce, because of weird sex stuff, because of awful things that we said to people, because of idiotic mistakes that we made, that we think about almost every single day, that we wish we could undo, but we can't because of the nature of how time is. All of that stuff, yep, it's a violation of God's perfect righteousness, but it's not the end game. All it does is point out that we cannot attain the righteousness of God on our own. in order to gain admission to this kingdom or citizenship or sonship or daughtership in this kingdom, the only way we can do that is with a righteousness that surpasses even that of the Pharisees, and the only way that happens is by it being imparted by the work of God. The prophets in the Old Testament tended to come in pretty hot and say stuff that most people would not have had the courage to say. They usually paid a pretty heavy price for it. And in this case, God's critique through the prophet Malachi of God's chosen people is absolutely withering. But all of this critique happens against the backdrop of God's ongoing redemptive plan. And the very next book of the Bible after Malachi is, well, look here, maybe you can hear it. It's Matthew. The very next thing that happens, 2 chapters of Bible after what we're reading in Malachi, is God following up saying exactly what his standards are and how they've been violated by sending his own son in the flesh to come and redeem the brokenness, fallenness, and sinfulness of the world by establishing a kingdom that no one deserves to be in. The deserved population of this kingdom is 0. It's God, and that's it. No human population. But what we're getting in Matthew is the story of the grace of God in action to forgive and to hand off the rightness and right standing of God to people who don't deserve it, who are hurt and dinged up by the stuff that happened to them, by the stuff that they got wrong, people like you and me. And then those broken people like you and me, according to what we're reading here in Matthew, their destiny is changed, their identity is changed. The take-home is not despair over things that happened in the past that you can't do anything about now. The take-home message of the Old Testament, and now Matthew as we're reading through it, is don't despair. Turn to Jesus, whose burden is light and who has unending compassion and forgiveness. There's no way we're getting all of this done today. I don't know if this is a good point to break or not, but we're going to hit pause there and pick up right where we left off next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again tomorrow.